If God is the mind which created the universe, what can we tell about God simply from that? In previous presentations, I have gone through how at the beginning of time, at the beginning of all things, you need to trace back that all causes are themselves effects of causes before them. That's the way in which we base our scientific worldview. But if you get to the first cause of all things, which logically must exist, there cannot be any cause of that cause. It cannot just go on infinitely, or there's nothing to cause something before that. There's no cause then whatsoever at the beginning. Now, we discussed the Big Bang and the way in which that is what we consider the first cause, or at least the cause of everything we know of. But that some people might suggest that gravity existed to cause it to come into effect. But that if reality itself versus the universe is something which is infinite and has always been, then the amount of time it would take to do that would not be that long. It wouldn't be infinite, at least. And so you'd have to continuously push back the beginning of the universe to such an extent that it never actually happens, just like a meeting which is always postponed the day before to the next week on the same day will never actually happen. And we determined that if this is the case, then what creates the universe, what causes the first cause, cannot be something which is governed by time, cannot be something which is governed by cause and effect. It must be something which is governed by something else, something which can go an entire infinity not creating and then cause the whole universe to come into effect an infinite time later and last for an infinity after that. What you're talking about is something which in some way makes a choice at a certain point, but isn't prompted or mechanized into making that choice. Within the Christian framework, you have what St. Paul preached God to be, which is that him in whom we have our being. And you have the Old Testament name of God as Yahweh, which means to be, or being with a capital B, or reality with a capital R. So within the Christian framework, and within that sort of monotheistic framework, with the exclusion of Islam, which has a different type of monotheism to Christianity's form of it, you have this idea within the Christian Jewish type of framework of a God who is being, is reality, is Yahweh. And that's something which was very important to me when I was looking into, am I in fact going to be a Christian as my parents raised me to be, or am I going to be something else? And I firstly looked into, did I think God existed? And I brought you through my argument which said, yes, firstly, there was a creator, some mechanism which brought the universe into being. And secondly, that mechanism must be something which isn't governed by cause and effect itself, or it's not that mechanism. So it must be something spiritual and something which went for infinity without creating and then decided at one point of its own, miro muto, to create. And then the universe came into being. Now, the question then, of course, is, well, there's a number of questions. Firstly, can that form of God, can that form of being actually communicate with us? Does it want to? Or is it one which simply created and doesn't want to communicate? Now, if it's the latter, there's no good for us involved in trying to find out too much more about it, except what logic can dictate for us. But if it's something which created and wants to have some sort of connection with what it created, with what it chose to create, then that's a different story. Then we need to look into history and see if it has tried to communicate with us, or whether our being or essence has some sort of form or logic or something in it which would cause us to try to have a connection with something like that. Now, we know that something created the universe at a certain point, whatever many billions of years ago. And we know that it created it. Now, the question then is, did it simply create it and leave it, or did it create it and is it continuously involved in it? Now, if this creating form is being itself, is reality, is that which gives being to all other things, which is the old Christian type of idea of what God is, then that sort of form would be something which created and kept the whole world. Now, if God is something which cannot change because it's not subject to change, because it's only subject to its own choices, then God is something which is not subject to time. It's something which created, but the creation is something which exists within it always, and every point of that creation exists within it always, in a sense that it's present for the whole thing, and it doesn't change at all because of the creation, but continues on as it is. It might influence the creation, but it never changes. Now, something which never changes and which created the universe is always back at that spot, creating it then at the same time, as well as always at every single other spot. And for me, if it's something which cannot change and it gives being to all things, then the potential for all things in some sense or other must be within that being, not in the sense of the potential for evil is within that being, though if that being's primary attribute by which we know it is choice, then obviously it would be something which, if it creates, would maybe, if it's creating in its own form, create other beings which could choose themselves to do things. But the framework within which they choose, the perfection within which they choose, and the veering from it would have to be a sort of system which exists within it. For instance, if there are multiple people in the world, if there's multiple beings, there'd have to be a sort of multiple within God. But if any being is separate from any other being, there'd have to be a oneness within God, which is separate. And this is what convinced me that Christianity, and in particular Trinitarian Christianity, was the correct path forward if I were to seek out God. That, in fact, the religion of my parents, of my grandparents and my ancestors, of my grandparents' ancestors, was the religion which I'd want to follow. And that religion would be Roman Catholicism, simply because it is a Trinitarian type of Christianity. And so I looked at this and I said, God must have a multitude within God, like the Trinity, three persons of God. One which is the Father, which produces the other two. One is the Son, and the relationship between them creates the Holy Spirit. And for me, that's as far as God needs to go to be able to create multiple beings. Because if there's just two beings within God, then there can only be God and maybe one other being. But if there's three beings within God, God's capable of creating more than that. God is capable of looking out and creating that. Now, those beings might be corrupted by their choices. And if God were creating something in his own image based on himself in some sense, any being would be something which is capable of making choices. So you'd have things which were closer to God, such as angels, which are themselves spiritual, which God might create, which might decide to ally with God or might decide to go against God. But if God is being and you're going against being itself, if you're going against reality itself, then that's quite something. You get the idea that the devil is the father of lies within the Bible, where Jesus Christ says that, and Jesus Christ says God is spirit and the devil is the father of lies and he's a murderer and so forth. But then you also have the idea within the Bible that this God which created the whole universe created human beings as a mixture between the spiritual, which God is, and the physical, which is the universe he created. So it's a step away from what the angels are. It's a step into the actual mechanical universe of creating something which is God-like and can make choices, but which is also subject to change and to the corruption of the world. That's something very interesting to me, because if we are spiritual, if we are like God in that sense, then we do have a beginning, because God would have had to have created us, but we wouldn't have an end. We'd in fact have a spiritual soul which lasts forever. That's, for me at least, the logical inference, because if something is spiritual, it cannot be changed. It cannot be subject to change. But if God is creating human beings based on his own image, based on something which can choose not to create for all of creation, and then choose at one specific point to create, then you're talking about a God which specifically chooses to create and which creates things like him. Now, if to be alive is to choose, which I think is how such a God would view being alive, rather than simply being something which exists by a mechanical process. If being alive is to choose, that God would have to be able to give its creations choices. And one of those choices might be to reject that God. But if you're rejecting being itself, if you're rejecting that which gives you your being, and if your being cannot be destroyed after it's created, at least some part of it, your spiritual part of you, then there's a problem. Then there's a situation in which you're rejecting that which gives you being. And for me, that again brings about the idea of hell, the idea of eternal damnation, of eternal suffering, because something has chosen against being, has rejected being and existence, but cannot stop existing. So it's sort of the suicide's mind frame just before they kill themselves, but for all of eternity. And suicides often will do things like tie their noose and put a lock on it or something. Or they'll do all sorts of things to try and make certain that they die, because at the last minute they often back out of it. But you can view the world in two ways, as Jordan Peterson, for instance, will tell you. You can view it as being a good thing, or being a bad thing. And you have the natalist, people who believe that humanity and birth is a good thing. And you have the anti-natalists who believe that suffering is worse than the meaning that existence gives us. And so you have those two viewpoints. And I'd say that hell is the eternity of the people who have the viewpoint that they would not want to exist, but because God made them as something which is eternal like himself, they cannot ever stop existing. And they reject being, they reject existence, they therefore reject life. But they cannot reject life because they were created as something which lasts forever. So it's sort of the hell of one who, if you can't stand your own company and you're forced to simply be and exist, imagine that for all of eternity, and it might be absolute hell. And yet, if you can stand your own company, if you're someone in whose company you can be, in which you can exist, and if you enjoy existing and existence and the idea of God, then all of eternity being present with God might be something which is very pleasant and something which you really enjoy, in contrast to the situation of someone to whom that would be eternal torment. Now, I'm not saying that the more specific ideas of hell are false, the ideas of what you see in the book of Revelation and things. I'm just saying that for me, when I looked at these sort of ideas, when I tried to logic out, does the God exist? And I said, yes, God exists, based on the fact that for reality to cause the universe to come into being, there'd have to be an infinite space between reality existing and the first causal domino moving over to create a universe. And that domino had to exist because all effects have to have a cause. And the ultimate cause of everything would be reality, obviously, the universe existing. But reality would have to exist for infinity before creating the universe, or it would always have to keep going back, because reality is something which is infinite. Because if reality ever once didn't exist, it would never exist. It's something which either must or mustn't exist. And so I got from that to that there must be a Trinitarian God, there must be a heaven and a hell, in a sense, if that God is creating things based on its own image, because that God can't create anything not based on its own image, because there's nothing outside of it to influence it. It is the thing which causes all other things to be, and so anything it causes to be, it might interact with that, but it can't change. And so everything it's created must, in some sense, be a reflection of it. That's where you have the Christian viewpoint of evil is not the opposite of good, it is the distortion of good. It's where things choose to be other than what they should be, and therefore they break their pattern. And the soul within Christianity is that blueprint of who we should be, of our being, of our person. And if we choose not to be that blueprint, then we choose to be evil. But then at the same time, that is the loss of the soul within Christianity. You choose not to be what God created you to be, and therefore the image God has of you in his mind is different from who you are. And therefore God does not know you, in a sense. And you're left with wanting to be dead for all of eternity because you don't think being is a good thing if you're evil. That's the ultimate where it goes to over, say, infinity. You don't want to exist, but you have to exist forever. And if you do want to exist and you have to exist forever, that's great. But that's the fundamental difference between the two types of being. And I'd say that it's a spiritual type of being, not a sort of thing of greed or those sort of things, which if you look at any of the deadly sins, any of those, if working upon a person for infinity, would turn them into something utterly evil. And if God created all of the angels at the beginning, at the very beginning, let's say for back to all eternity, or even back billions of years ago, just imagine how evil things like the devil would be. And within Christianity, the devil is not some foolish thing which is less intelligent than us. The devil and the angels are far more intelligent than any human being. And the demons, which are fallen angels, just like the devil would be a fallen form of the highest angel, are incredibly intelligent beings which have existed forever. And you cannot defeat them with your mere human mind. The God would be able to defeat them, obviously. But it's, for me, these sort of things led me to, there was only one system which existed with that. Now, you could say that God would be pantheistic and God exists in everything and things like that, but then that's a God who is changing. That's a God who can't really be something which is spiritual. It would have to be something within reality and therefore not God, because God would be constantly changing as we change and moving about. And God, if he is doing those things, would not have been able to create, because infinity being infinitely back in time, you'd always have to push the date of creation further and further back until it doesn't happen, just like that meeting never happens. So the only type of God I can imagine is a spiritual God, a Trinitarian God, and a God who follows the moral framework of Christianity. And that's where I decided I in fact do want to be Christian and I do want to be Catholic. And that was after a lot of soul searching for me and a lot of philosophy and philosophizing, I'm probably saying that wrong, to try and come to a conclusion. Let me know what you think, and if you have any ideas on my ideas. Thank you.